Good afternoon, everybody. Good day to those of you who are further to the west. I'm Clifford Channon, welcoming you on behalf of the 9/11 Memorial Museum to this program with Peter Bergen. Very, very much looking forward to this. Let me give an introduction of Peter, which is really just a fraction of so much of what he has accomplished. But he is, as you know, Peter Bergen, a journalist, documentary producer, and he's vice president for global studies and fellows at New America, which is a foreign policy think tank or a policy think tank. He's the CNN national security analyst and also professor of practice at Arizona State University, where he's co-director of the Center on the Future of War. He's the author or editor of 7 books, 3 of which were New York Times bestsellers, and 4 of which were named among the best nonfiction books of the year by the Washington Post. My guess is with his new book, that list of accolades is going to grow. His books have been translated into 21 languages, and documentaries based on his books have been nominated for 2 Emmys and won an Emmy for Best Documentary. He has held teaching positions at Harvard, Johns Hopkins. He was for years a contributing editor both at Foreign Policy and the New Republic. And he's also the chairman of the board of the Global Special Operations Foundation, which is a nonprofit advocating for the interests of special operations forces. He's also on the board of the James W. Foley Legacy Foundation, which advocates for Americans being held hostage and for journalists in conflict zones. And one last credential, which on my end of things is at the top of the list. Peter has been consistently a great supporter of the museum and the memorial. We have turned to him over the years to dig into the vast well of knowledge that he has. He was an advisor to us on the creation of the exhibition in the museum, Revealed the Hunt for bin Laden, and which turned also into a documentary on History Channel. So Peter, on top of everything that you've accomplished, I really do want to thank you on all of our behalf for the help you have given us over the years.
Thank you, Cliff, and working as an advisor on that exhibit was tremendously, interesting, and the exhibit, is a definitive account of what happened. And I know it took 3 years of work. I mean, it was not and it gave me a real insight into how do you actually make an exhibit come alive that really works for museum goers.
Wonderful, thank you. Let me ask you, you've written a number of books that touch on bin Laden and al-Qaeda. And in this one, which is called The Rise and Fall of Osama bin Laden, I can hold it up, you actually reflect back on some of your earlier observations and take a step back and say, this is something that I overestimated or misunderstood or whatever it is. But how has your sense of bin Laden and al-Qaeda evolved over the more than 20 years that you've been following this? And what are some of the points that you sort of rethought along the way?
Okay, A, thank you for having me on, and B, thank you for anybody who's tuned into this for listening. I mean, the biggest recalibration comes with the documents that came out of the Abbottabad compound, because bin Laden had no idea these documents would fall into the hands of the U.S. Navy SEALs, and they're really they're his real thoughts. I mean, whether they were private letters to his wives or lengthy memos to other leaders of al-Qaeda, or there was also a bin Laden family journal that was released by the Trump administration as part of the final tranche of documents. And that's really a treasure trove, because it kind of outlines what he was thinking for the last 5.5 years of his life and what he was writing. And these are his real thoughts. They're not, he didn't intend them for public consumption. So that certainly helped change. I hadn't really written a book directly about bin Laden since a book called Manhunt, which came out in 2012, which was about the hunt for bin Laden. Since then, the Obama administration released 3 tranches of documents, and then the Trump administration released all the documents. And there's 470,000 files, many of which are completely not useful because his kids were watching cartoons, or he would draw 50 versions of the same memo. But it boils down to about 6,000 pages of private letters and documents. And some of the surprises in there are one, his reliance on his two oldest wives, both of whom had PhDs, to do his kind of thinking for him and his editing. I think people would be surprised that he was married to two women with PhDs who had sort of independent lives before they met him and joined his jihadist project, and B, the important role they played in helping him think through like how to respond to the Arab Spring, how to respond to the upcoming anniversary of 9/11, which at the time would have been the 10th anniversary of 9/11. So that was one set of surprises. Another set of surprises was the fact that his two bodyguards were about to leave him, and retentions became so bad with his bodyguards that he wrote them a letter on January 15th, 2011, saying, I'm sorry that our argument about became so contentious, and I'm putting in writing what we've agreed. This is a surprising letter to write because his bodyguards were living with him on the same compound. They were, just living yards away. So it showed how much the bodyguards were resenting looking after the world's most wanted man. They were being paid only $100 a month each. Bin Laden always had been a bit of a miser, and they were taking a lot of risks, and they were right to be worried because, of course, both of them would be killed, and one of their wives would be killed the night of the raid on the Abbottabad compound where he was hiding. He another big theme in the diary, the Bin Laden family diary, is how concerned he was about the Arab Spring. He knew, in his own words, that these were the most momentous events in centuries, and yet his ideas and followers were not part of it. And the Bin Laden family, the two adult daughters and his two oldest wives, would meet every night to discuss what to say about this, because they truly believed that if Bin Laden delivered the right speech, he could somehow take control of the Arab Spring and insert himself as a leader. Now, this was quite delusional, but it was a delusion that they all labored under. So these new documents coming out are certainly helped, reframe and enrich my understanding of Bin Laden and the understanding of him writ large.
Let me ask, Peter, you go back, I believe, pre 9/11. The interview that you were involved with takes you into the 90s when you were working for CNN as a producer. And, there was a long journey for him, which included, of course, 9/11, and then his death in Pakistan in May 2011. But your exposure to him at that point, what were your initial impressions? He was already a self-declared leader of this war against the United States, but obviously it was not getting the attention it would after 9/11. And you mentioned in your previous answer that, there was a delusional quality to what he believed about what he could accomplish. Was that sense of being deluded present in your mind as you sat with him and had those interview conversations that Peter Arnett carried out for CNN?
No, we didn't. I mean, he seemed pretty serious, and he, didn't seem to be suffering from any kind of classical delusions. I mean, he wasn't sort of mentally unstable or anything. He seemed pretty serious and quite well informed. So I didn't have that. I mean, I just think that his analysis of the United States and its likely reaction to 9/11 was, it was massively off. And he comes from this, as rich family, and his money allowed him to do things that if he didn't have money, he wouldn't have been able to do. And I think that is a factor in all this. I mean, he didn't have $300 million in the bank, as was initially reported shortly after 9/11, but he did have about $20 million. When his oldest brother died, he cashed out something like $8 million. Steve Cole, in his book, The Bin Ladens, has the best account of all this. And then he kept a $10 million interest in the family company. And the family company is obviously very big, but there were, 20 wives and 4 current wives and 55 children when the patriarch died in a plane crash. So, once you've split up all the money between all the various wives and kids, he ended up with $20 million effectively. And that allowed him considerable freedom of movement because, he was able to fund the services office in Afghanistan and Pakistan, which was the group set up in 1984 dedicated to fighting the Soviets, to the tune of about $300,000 a year. a lot of money in the mid-1980s, obviously. And then B, he was able to sort of finance al-Qaeda in its early days. And so I do think this, that was a path that was not open to just anybody. He was able to kind of use his money to do things that other people either couldn't do or wouldn't do. And there were plenty of people telling him, setting up your own military organization in Afghanistan during the Soviet war was not a smart idea. I mean, they knew that he had no military experience. His brother-in-law, Jamal Khalifa, who I interviewed at length in Jeddah in Saudi Arabia before he was murdered in Madagascar in 2007, Jamal Khalifa traveled to Afghanistan to talk to bin Laden in the mid-90s to sort of say, sorry, in the late 1980s to tell him, setting up your own military organization, fighting the Soviets is kind of a crazy idea. You're going to get people killed. So there are lots of parts of his family background that allowed him to do things. And yet, on the other hand, he had 54 siblings, none of whom chose this path. So one of the things I try and say in the book, well, I don't editorialize a lot in the book, I don't think, is like this transformation took place over a long period of time. Nothing about it was inevitable. But getting back to the main point, bin Laden just had a serious misunderstanding of what the United States would do after 9/11. He began to believe his own propaganda that the United States was weak and was weak like the former Soviet Union. And he based that analysis on the American pullout from Lebanon after the Marine barracks attack in 1983, and the US pullout from Somalia after the Black Hawk Down incident in 1993. And, the United States doesn't have significant interest in either Somalia or Lebanon. And to think that after an attack on the Trade Center and the Washington, that somehow the United States would radically revise its policy in the Middle East and pull out was a serious delusion. And his experience of the West was very limited. The longest experience he had was 2.5 months when he was 14, when he attended summer school in Oxford. And it's an experience he didn't want to repeat. He told his own family decades later that when he was asked to go back to England, he refused because he described the British as, quote, morally degenerate. And then he probably had a 2-week trip to the United States when he was, a relatively young man. He is recently married. And so that was his some experience of the West. And it was not big. And I think that he just completely misunderstood what was going to happen after 9/11.
It's interesting. And this came up as we were developing the exhibition. You really laid out clearly in the book. And I think as a footnote to all of this, I think it'd be helpful for you to talk a little bit about, there was a sense, and it has been repeated, that the U.S. in its support for the fighting against the Soviets in the 1980s somehow was supporting bin Laden and al-Qaeda. CIA poured a lot of money into that, but as you describe it, was actually a very small CIA station in Pakistan, a handful of people. And the money went to the Pakistani intelligence service, which then distributed onward to the Afghan resistance, not to the so-called Arab Afghans, of which bin Laden was the leader. But I would like you to sort of, because I think it's an important clarification that comes up very frequently in terms of the US and its implication that somehow it actually funded these activities of bin Laden and his colleagues in those early days of the Soviet-Afghan war.
Yeah. Well, I think you summarized what actually happened quite well, which was, Pakistan did not want the CIA to be funding any of the Afghan groups. They wanted to make their own choices, people that operated in them. And so one of the main recipients was Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, who's still around today, who's an Islamist militant. He received about 20% of the $3 billion, so a large amount, $600 million. And he was certainly no friend of the United States. Wasn't there and hasn't been in the. So that was maybe a mistake to kind of totally subcontract it out to the Pakistanis. But there wasn't really it wasn't really much of a choice. The Pakistanis were not going to allow the United States to directly fund these groups. And the CIA actually had an interest in plausible deniability. They were trying to give the Soviets a black eye, but they were not trying to expand the war in such a way that the United States might get into a direct conflict with the United States, with the Soviet Union. I mean, it was a proxy war and conducted through proxies. And the Pakistanis were kind of the paymasters, and the CIA supplied the checks, and that's how it worked. And in fact, CIA officers didn't go into Afghanistan. Maybe they popped across the border, to get a kind of a picture. But it would have been a huge propaganda coup for the Soviets to capture a CIA officer, and so CIA officers were under strict instructions not to go into Afghanistan. So they had the CIA officers in Islamabad, who were 6 people. At any given moment, they were really writing checks, and they weren't really leaving. They weren't meeting with Afghans, let alone with the Afghan Arabs like Osama bin Laden. And now we're 4 decades after the end of that war, and there's really been no evidence that kind of contradicts how you characterized it and how I'm characterizing it. At this point, if there was a CIA officer responsible for this, he or she would have come forward. If there was somebody in al-Qaeda who knew about this, they would have come forward. And even if they didn't come forward, there would be pieces of paper that somehow would come. These kinds of things don't remain secret forever. So it's just one of those things that's always presented as an axiom by those who believe it, but there's never any evidence that's attached to it. And plenty of people, by the way, eyewitnesses in Pakistan and in the United States, and even within al-Qaeda, who said that this simply didn't happen.
There's a precedent before bin Laden for leaders of terrorist organizations to understand the publicity value of what they were doing. And in fact, to think that the publicity they would gain for their actions was in some cases more important than the number of victims. If you could create enough of a spectacular impact, that would carry your message forward, and your followers presumably would expand, or at least they would understand, your followers would, that you were active doing the things you said you ought to be doing. Bin Laden also had a very acute sense of the value of publicity and aimed a lot of his certainly messaging, but understood very well that this was the way he was going to spread his message across what he conceived of as a global constituency. It was not a national constituency. It was something that he imagined emerging around the Muslim world. Talk then a bit about publicity as a strategy, as part of sort of the violence planning that al-Qaeda did over the years and that bin Laden led.
Well, it's a great question. I mean, Brian Michael Jenkins famously said in the 70s that terrorists wanted a lot of people watching, but not a lot of people dying. And the reason for that was, if you have like mass casualty terrorist deaths, it can turn off potential recruits or fence sitters. It might inspire a giant crackdown. And I think bin Laden rewrote that to say, I want a lot of people dying and watching. And that was new. In terms of, the Munich Olympics, and I don't get into this in the book, but when you asked a question, Cliff, I thought, as you were talking, the Munich Olympics is a really interesting example of that put the Palestinian cause on the map. If you think about the 1972 Munich Olympics, it's really the first time, as far as I can know, where the Olympics were, there was live coverage, live color television had just kind of come in, and there were, kind of news anchors who were there, like Peter Jennings and others. And they got a tremendous amount of publicity for their cause. And certainly that was their intent. And obviously bin Laden, 9/11 was probably the most watched event in human history. It took place in the media capital of the world, New York. And bin Laden was keenly aware of publicity and the publicity it generated. And in a videotape that was recovered after 9/11, he said something along the lines of, this deed said in words that could be understood in China, kind of what our message is. And so, he definitely understood that terrorism was about getting the message out. And Maggie Thatcher famously said that the oxygen of terrorism is publicity. And when she was prime minister, and she, I think, wanted to sort of say, well, if no one paid any attention to terrorism from the media, then it wouldn't have any impact. And in a sense, I guess she was implying that journalists in some ways are sort of fanning this problem. But I mean, to me, I don't think that's a particularly helpful point, because there's, generally speaking, terrorist attacks are news, and they can't be ignored. And certainly 9/11 was one of the biggest, was one of the hinge events of American history, with all sorts of outcomes that bin Laden didn't expect. But certainly he valued his own publicity and the publicity that came with these attacks.
So let me, just taking a note, let's pick up the story of bin Laden's escape from the Tora Bora mountain complex in Afghanistan and his movements through Afghanistan, ultimately into Pakistan. So ultimately, this is a nearly 10-year period in which there are, up until the year before the raid, no real leads. And so how did he get out? And there's a U.S. failure there, I think you describe in the book.
Yeah.
But let's start with that. Yeah.
Yeah. One of the other things I love documents, like anybody who's interested in writing history. And it's not just the documents that came out of Abbottabad that are relatively new. There are other documents that have been very helpful that have come out in recent years. So in 2015, Ayman al-Zawahiri, the now leader of al-Qaeda, wrote his own account of the Battle of Tora Bora and explained in more detail, and he was an eyewitness because he was with bin Laden at the time. And he said that, we departed the battlefield at 11 p.m. on December 12, 2001. And that, I'd always known that was sort of the window. Here we have an actual eyewitness participant saying this is the moment. And this was significant for a few reasons. One is it was the so-called Night of Power, which is one of the most sacred days in the Muslim calendar. It's the night that the Prophet Muhammad descended into heaven. It's the night when the gates of heaven are opened, the 27th day of Ramadan. So for people like bin Laden, it would have been very significant that they escaped on this incredibly significant religious date. And it was also the day that Donald Rumsfeld was being briefed on the new Iraq war plan by General Tommy Franks, who was the theater commander in Afghanistan. Rumsfeld had tasked Franks a week earlier to rewrite the 800-page war plan. And so there's an 8.5-hour time difference between Afghanistan and the east coast of the United States. And so as bin Laden's escaping, Rumsfeld is getting this sort of the briefing from Franks, which tells you a lot about where their heads were at. And then another really interesting document that came out was leaked by Al Jazeera in 2014, which is the Pakistanis did their own kind of independent commission with 4 fairly senior retired civil servants or army officers. And it's, I think, a very good piece of work because they interviewed a couple of hundred people. They are very critical of Pakistan's ignoring the fact that bin Laden was in Pakistan for a decade, and very critical of Pakistan's kind of feckless response the night of the SEAL operation. And they really chart exactly what bin Laden was doing. I mean, they interviewed the 3 surviving wives, they interviewed the 1 surviving wife of the bodyguard, and then they interviewed others. And so there's a lot of information about where bin Laden was exactly when in the 10 years that he went into Kunar in eastern Afghanistan, which is a very remote mountainous area, sort of very much confounding what people thought he would do. They thought he would go back into Pakistan. Well, instead, he spent a year in Kunar in a very, very remote area. He was protected by Gulbuddin Hekmatyar's men. I mentioned Gulbuddin earlier. And then he went back into Pakistan. He went to Peshawar, a big city, met up with one of his wives there, and then went to Swat, which is described as sort of the Switzerland of Pakistan. He spent about a year there. He had another child. with his youngest wife there. With his two wives, he then went to a small provincial city called Haripur. His youngest wife had two kids, and they pretended that she was deaf and dumb, because like, why was clearly an Arab woman having kids in a provincial city in Pakistan would make no sense. And then from Haripur, they went to Abbottabad for 5.5 years. Anyway, so this is another example of a document that has come out in the intervening years that kind of sheds light on what bin Laden was doing. Just one other quick point from there. He met with Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the operational commander of 9/11. He met him in SWAT in early 2003, according to this document. And they spent 2 weeks together. And then shortly after that, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed was arrested in Rawalpindi, which is the garrison town outside Islamabad, which is where the Pakistani military is sort of headquartered. So this document kind of helps, there was a big blank about where was bin Laden, what was he doing. This document really puts together quite a lot of information about what he was doing. And then the Abbottabad documents explain a lot about what he was thinking.
That Pakistani Commission report is indeed a remarkable document. And, the tone of it is so angry about the way the Pakistanis handled it. And yet at the same time, I think it was a Supreme Court justice who was the chairman of that commission. You could tell there's only so far that he could go in writing a document, which was not a document for the government per se. It was a document for the parliament. And so, very much not a power center in Pakistan. But you could tell just the frustration and him framing this as a choice between incompetence and complicity on the part of the Pakistanis, that there was really no way to explain it.
Well, that was the kind of dilemma that the Pakistani military faced, because they were either incompetent or complicit. And they knew that they weren't complicit because they had no idea that bin Laden was there. And so they had to admit to incompetence. And Cliff, you may recall when in those weeks immediately after it was probably the worst time for the Pakistani military in the history of Pakistan, because there was so much. The parliament has been pretty weak, relatively speaking, but the parliament really called the military on the carpet, and because if the United States could waltz into Pakistan without anyone noticing, what did it say about India doing the same thing? And so there was a lot of anger at the Pakistani military, but in the end, there was one of the questions that everybody asks is, why bin Laden's living around the corner, very near the west point of Pakistan. Why? Somebody must have known that he was there. And the answer is, they didn't. This is one of those things which is hard to prove negatives, but there's nothing on these documents suggesting bin Laden had some sort of Pakistani reminder, or that Pakistani officials had any idea where he was. He was hiding. Bin Laden was hiding from people on the compound. One of the bodyguard's wives didn't know Osama bin Laden, mysterious Arab who was living with Saud. So he had no reason to influence the Pakistanis, and he didn't.
I want to just note we're aware of a bit of a sound problem on the feed. So just so you all know, we're working on that. Coming back to the Pakistanis, they have had very much an in and out relationship with the United States over all of these years. The early years after 9/11, closer than it would become at a later point. But this was a factor in the President Obama's decision not to tell the Pakistanis that the raid was taking place, because he didn't trust that it would be kept secret and that someone wouldn't give bin Laden advance notice of this.
Yeah, if you're getting interference, what can I make a quick suggestion? I just click on the Zoom link again, and we'll just have a new link.
I think probably, since I didn't understand what you said, other than recognizing what the problem is, it may be best to do that.
Yeah, let's do that. I think that's going to be the quickest.
All right, and I will. I was joking with Peter before the program began that in case there's a technical problem, I've worked up my own act to do online alone here. But that's not true. And now I find myself in a position of having to do it without having actually prepared it. Well, you shouldn't speak out of turn. I do want to come back to this because Peter, who will be back shortly, I'm sure, he does talk about other reporting that purports to prove, or at least claims, that bin Laden's whereabouts were known to the Pakistanis. But that reporting has not been borne out by any other reporting. And it's not sourced beyond individual anonymous sources. And so the one thing that I do recall I asked that question as part of all of our interviews for the bin Laden exhibition and film project. And none of the American officials who were involved thought that the Pakistanis knew at any significant level. I mean, you could never, they said, dismiss the possibility that some police officer somewhere knew that something was going on in the compound. But the other point, which Peter makes in the book, but which also was made very clear in our interviews, that by folks who are on the military side of this, that they were monitoring Pakistani communications all throughout this mission. And there was never a sign in any of those communications that the Pakistanis were aware of what was happening, where it was happening, or why it was happening. The Pakistanis were aware that something was going on, and ultimately they were able to locate that something. But nothing in any of the recorded or overheard transmissions indicated that somebody on the Pakistani side was saying, they found bin Laden. That is not the case. So it is worth noting that. The other thing to say, and Peter was alluding to all of those documents that came out of the Navy SEAL sweep for intelligence matters in the compound. Some of you will remember that we did a program with Peter's colleague at New America, Nellie LaHood, who has reviewed all of those documents and will have a book coming out, really going into chapter and verse on so much of what is contained in the documents. Peter used those same documents as well. But we will be bringing Nellie in for a program as her book comes out. And she has some very, very interesting conclusions about what is going on, or what went on at that point. So I see Peter.
Okay, is this better now?
Yeah, you're back. Thank you.
Yeah, sorry about that.
And okay. I did tell the folks that you and I had discussed my stand-up routine prior, but when I was called on it, I didn't have it. So that's just what's going to happen. Anyway, let us get back to business, Peter, and thank you for coming back. The founding documents, as you describe them, of al-Qaeda, really do put global jihad at the forefront of the organization. So, any effort to explain or minimize or mitigate in some way what they were trying to do is contradicted by their very foundational statement of existence. Now, this was quite a radical departure. And I wonder if you think of bin Laden as an original thinker in this regard. Certainly, the targeting of the United States was a foreign activity, but it was really rooted in what he thought was the American suppression of Muslims being able to live as bin Laden thought they should or could. And also that this was an ambition that he had on a global scale that, of course, as we know, targeted the United States, but had much bigger targets in mind as well, or other targets.
Yeah, I mean, I think he is an original thinker. I think he was wrong about a lot of things, and his analysis of American weakness was wrong. But I mean, the key reason I wrote the book is bin Laden's one of the few people who changed history. He effectively rewrote American foreign policy for the first 2 decades of the 21st century. He changed the greater Middle East in all sorts of unexpected ways, not ways that he thought were going to happen. But one of the outcomes of 9/11 was, the occupation of and invasion of Afghanistan, later Iraq, military operations in countries like Somalia, Yemen, Libya. All these were not anticipated by bin Laden, but they are the kind of the consequences of 9/11, and in addition to all the people who died on 9/11, and then all the people who died in the various wars the United States has fought since 9/11. So he was an original thinker. His big idea was the United States would pull out of the Middle East if enough military pressure was put on it. That did not happen. But it had the merit for bin Laden that it was, he had a bunch of people from Sudan and Egypt and Yemen and Libya as part of his organization. And this was a sort of sufficiently big tent idea that everybody could get around, because they all had, they could all agree that the United States was a bad thing, even if they had differences about like what their priorities were, whether that, And, one of the, you going back to an earlier question you had, Cliff, was like one of the things I definitely revised in the book, and I've been revising for some period of time, that could, now say it with real definitive evidence, is that there was a narrative after 9/11 that Zawahiri, the present leader of al-Qaeda, was the brains of al-Qaeda. People would even, that would even be in the headline of pieces about al-Qaeda. Well, that isn't true. The big idea attacking the United States was bin Laden's idea. It wasn't Zawahiri's. Zawahiri was actually a pretty minor player in al-Qaeda before 9/11. He had no role in any plotting for the embassy attacks in 98, the Cole attack in 2000, 9/11 itself. Bin Laden didn't include Zawahiri in those discussions. And Zawahiri had a very small group of guys. I quote the variety of people. Some people say he had 5 followers in Afghanistan. Some people say he had 7. Some people say he had 10. And it's often forgotten that before the embassy attacks in 98, which was really bin Laden's big first operation, Zawahiri was actually in jail in Dagestan because he was trying to get to Chechnya with a couple of followers, and they were trying to join the Chechen anti-Soviet, anti-Russian resistance. And he was arrested, and he was in a jail in Dagestan for 6 months. So by the time he showed back up in Afghanistan, Zawahiri was pretty much a marginal figure. Bin Laden used him because he wanted to present to the world a global Islamic front. And of course, Zawahiri was Egyptian. So, bin Laden was really using Zawahiri for window dressing when he'd have him sit beside him at press conferences or in videos, in order to sort of present that al-Qaeda really was a global organization. But Zawahiri didn't, when it came to these big decisions and these big strategies, it was all bin Laden's. And yes, it was original, but it was also, of course, deeply flawed.
Let's talk about that a little bit, because you say that the 9/11 attacks were a hinge moment in American history, and I think most people would agree with that. And many of the things that followed did not turn out the way the United States hoped or intended that they would. And yet at the same time, you're critical of bin Laden's strategy, in the sense that, al-Qaeda was decimated. It was driven from its safe haven, although we'll come to current situation later in the interview. But, even though he turned out to be wrong about the particulars of things, was he right about the bigger picture of forcing America into an overstretch that would ultimately damage its standing in the world, not undermine in some significant way the American credibility, reputation, however you want to frame it, as even if bin Laden didn't necessarily intend it to be the way it happened, didn't it kind of happen anyway, at least to some degree?
Well, it did, but what was bin Laden's actual purpose with undermining the United States? It was to produce regime change in the Middle East, particularly the Saudis. I mean, now his theory of the case was, once the United States pulls out of the Middle East, the Saudi regime will crumble without its support. And that hasn't happened. I mean, the Saudi regime is arguably in a stronger place today because of MBS's sort of, dictatorial reign than it's been at any point, in the last, MBS has made the Saudi state even stronger. So it didn't, yes, it certainly has helped to undermine America's standing in the world. But that was, bin Laden couldn't see 20 years in the future and the US pullout from Afghanistan. So I don't really, and the other thing also, let's take the assessment that, the United States has spent $6 trillion on these wars. By the way, much of which goes to, people say we spent $6 trillion on these wars. It's worth recalling that almost all that money is spent on ourselves. It's not like it sort of, it spent on contractors and U.S. military expenses and the U.S. government expenses, etc. As a percentage of the United States, I think on 9/11, the value of the U.S. economy was $14 trillion, and I believe it's in sort of the 22 trillion range now. So you times that by 20, I mean, it's a pretty large number. So yes, we've spent, these wars have been expensive, but the United States is a huge economy. It's not like this bankrupted us as some sort of like there's been a lot of projection onto bin Laden that he intended to bankrupt us. Well, that shows a poor understanding of economics, because even though that's a large figure, it's still, the United States is a massive economy. And then throw in the fact that bin Laden, 3 years after 9/11, he started talking about, the 9/11 attacks were a clever attempt to draw the United States into endless wars in the Middle East. There was no evidence that was really his plan. He didn't plan for what actually happened. He thought it would be cruise missile strikes or, an assassination attempted against himself after 9/11. And he was surprised by the fall of the Taliban. He didn't plan for it. So, I mean, you're right, Cliff. In some ways, some of the things that he hoped to happen might have happened, but they happened in very unexpected ways. A lot of it, and so much of what has actually happened were mistakes that we made, based rather than sort of clever things that he did. The big one being, of course, the Iraq War, which essentially I say in the book, the Iraq War saved al-Qaeda. And of course, al-Qaeda in Iraq later evolved into ISIS. But that was a major unforced error on our behalf, which bin Laden had no idea would happen, but was very happy about when it did.
Yep. Let me ask anybody who would like to bring a question into the conversation. You have the chat bubble at the bottom of the screen, so you can do that. Peter, let's talk a little bit more about sort of where we are now. You cite in the Abbottabad papers that the SEALs collected considerable evidence that the Taliban and al-Qaeda remained aligned, remained in close contact and coordination throughout the years of bin Laden's exile up into his death. And that has continued. We had Edmund Fitton Brown, former British ambassador, now the UN coordinator of these sanctions against al-Qaeda and the Taliban, a couple of weeks back, talking about the continuing close relationship between al-Qaeda and the Taliban. So, in spite of the fact that bin Laden precipitated the end of the Taliban regime at that point by attacking the United States and leaving the Taliban in this position where they would bear the brunt of the American response, and in spite of the fact that the Taliban itself was not able to protect al-Qaeda, which was then decimated, as I said earlier, that relationship continues. How would you characterize the current state of that relationship and the basis for it? Is it ideological, theological? Is it still sort of a meeting of the minds in terms of tactics and strategy? Is it true that they're as close as ever, do you think? And why?
Well, I'm glad that you mentioned Edward Fitton Brown. His reports for the UN. The UN has a al-Qaeda Taliban sanctions sort of implementation cell, and they issue, I think, very interesting and informative reports. Those reports are pretty clear. The last one that was public, came out in June, talked about how the UN, al-Qaeda and the Taliban remain closely aligned. It identifies Siraj Haqqani as on the leadership council of al-Qaeda. This is fascinating because last week, Taliban announced its new cabinet. Siraj Haqqani is the Minister of Interior in the new Taliban government. And I mean, that sort of speaks for itself. So the idea that the Taliban and al-Qaeda were going to split or did split, and there was a lot of wishful thinking around this question that wasn't true. Why are they still together? I think they share a pretty kind of common view of the world. The Taliban, when I talked to members of al-Qaeda back in the past, they described the Taliban pre 9/11 as sort of the nearest that they'd seen to a government in power that was really doing the right thing. And when bin Laden's vision of the future, to the extent that he had one, he didn't really lay one out, I think was Taliban-style theocracies from Indonesia to Morocco. So I think according to the UN, these relationships are based on intermarriage, shared experiences, I think I take these UN reports very much at face value. They're based on member states reporting. I think the UN is an independent organization without an axe to grind in any of this. And I'm glad that you mentioned them, Cliff, because I think anybody watching this who wants to know more can just find these on the web. I mean, they're publicly available documents, and I think they're quite useful.
Agreed. Where are we now, Peter? And I want you to take apart a little bit the question of the forever wars, and the war in Afghanistan has at least ended for now. Who knows what's going to come? Because, September 10th, 2001, there was a Taliban government supported by and supporting al-Qaeda. September 10th, 2021, there is a Taliban government back in place, and with some, perhaps to some degree, undetermined relationship, but nonetheless a strong relationship still with al-Qaeda. I mean, what are the capacities of al-Qaeda at this point, and what do you see as the risk that it may increase over the years, because do they have this safe haven back again?
Yeah, I mean, it's as you imply, it's kind of a strange place for us to be, where 20 years later, in fact, the Taliban is in a much stronger position today than it was before 9/11, because they've got a 75,000-man army. It's been fighting for 20 years. They have all this American, mine-resistant vehicles and armored Humvees and American military equipment that they've captured. And the resistance, which was, on September 9th, 2001, al-Qaeda killed Akbar Shah Massoud, who was leading the anti-Taliban resistance. Today, his son, who was 12 on 9/11, is now 32. He's leading what remains of the anti-Taliban resistance in very obscure parts of the Panjshir Valley. But clearly that resistance has got a very, 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 very tough road to climb if they were to really try and resist the Taliban at this point. But things can change. Al-Qaeda can regroup in Afghanistan. Joby Warwick, a very good reporter for the Post, Washington Post, has a piece today, which I think voices some skepticism about al-Qaeda's ability to regroup. Certainly, it's been led by Ayman al-Zawahiri, who's an incompetent leader. Certainly, they've not been able to carry out significant attacks in the West for a long time. Al-Qaeda in Yemen did have some kind of role in the attack in Pensacola, which killed 3 U.S. sailors with a Saudi military officer. Al-Qaeda in Yemen was certainly apprised of the plot, but not clear if it directed the plot. But these groups certainly have, their ability to attack the United States is very, very, very low. But they have some time to regroup. The Islamic Emirates going to be a very exciting development for people with jihadist ideas in the West. Some people in Europe may try and go to Afghanistan for training, and some may succeed. Some may do attacks in Europe. People may do attacks in the name of al-Qaeda, excited by this victory of the Taliban victory. That they can be just sitting in front of their computers, and we saw this in the summer of 2014 with the ISIS caliphate. People didn't have to actually travel to Syria or Iraq to carry out attacks in the name of ISIS. So I think that we'll see some of that. I mean, I just don't see why we wouldn't. But things, the politics around this could change if the Taliban conduct ethnic cleansing against the Shia Hazaras, which they did before 9/11. If the Taliban kill the American dual national, even if it's a lower level Taliban, if there's an attack on American interests in the region traceable to Afghanistan by a terrorist group, if there's a significant terrorist attack in Europe traceable to Afghanistan, all these things can change the the political picture around this. They certainly did for President Obama in Iraq in the summer of 2014, when ISIS was threatening the Yazidis with genocide and also murdered American journalist Jim Foley and other American journalists and aid workers. So, I don't think the Taliban is in a very, very good position right now. Circumstances can change, because I'm not convinced that they won't either do something dumb or allow something done to be done from their territory, which would kind of change the equation.
Let me ask, William Rath has a question about the succession. You've spoken quite critically of Zawahiri's leadership. I think in the book you refer to it as a black hole of charisma or something like that. Is there someone in view at all? And if that person were really in view, the US might have killed them by now. But is there someone out there who could become a charismatic leader of al-Qaeda, carrying the message of bin Laden forth?
Short answer is yes. Saif al-Adil, who's this former Egyptian special forces officer, has been part of al-Qaeda from the beginning. He's the military commander of the group. He lived in Iran for years under some form of house arrest. It's not really clear where he is now. He might be back in Afghanistan. He would be the most likely. He was the interim leader of al-Qaeda shortly when bin Laden died. There was a 6-week sort of interregnum where they debated whether or not Zawahiri, who was the designated successor, should actually become the successor. And he was appointed the successor. But Saif al-Adil would be a natural choice and might well be an effective kind of new leader.
Let me ask then, coming to the end, the U.S. has withdrawn. Taliban is back in power. You've talked about mistakes that the Taliban could make that would change the situation again. It does sound to me like you don't think this is over, although maybe you won't predict what's going to happen next. But the book that you've written, is the conclusion of the life of bin Laden. But as you say, his influence and his ideas have not concluded in terms of their impact. So it's a little bit of a speculative question, or it's an extremely speculative question, to think about, what other turnings might be coming in the road ahead, and or is this over in some fundamental way?
I don't think it's over. I mean, because I think the people with these ideas, who are a tiny minority in the world of Islam, kind of believe that God is on their side, and they will take the Taliban victory as a sign that God is on the Taliban side. And it's going to be it's already exciting for these groups, and I think we're just in another cycle. It's not an existential moment for the United States. We have very good defensive capabilities. The proof is no foreign terrorist organization has attacked us successfully, other than that Pensacola attack. And even there, it's not clear if that attack was directed by al-Qaeda in Yemen or more just that they knew it was coming. So our defensive capabilities are pretty high. But give these groups time and space, they will regroup. And we've seen that in Iraq in the summer of 2014. We saw that in Afghanistan before 9/11. We saw that in Yemen. These groups aren't strong. They prey on weak hosts, or they prey on willing hosts. I think the Taliban will be a pretty willing host. So I just think we're in another cycle of this. It doesn't mean that we're going to see a large-scale attack on the United States, but it could mean attacks on American targets in the region, attacks in Europe, attempts to bring down, kind of planes somewhere in the world. It was interesting that there was fairly good reporting that the Taliban was able to take out an anti-Taliban commander using an armed drone, and the reporting seems quite convincing. So, I'm not by nature a sky is falling kind of person, but I do think we're because of an unforced error by the Biden administration, we're in a situation where we're in another chapter of this particular story. And I've always thought that these groups, that when we choose to talk about how to deal with them, I think a good verb is manage. This is a problem that can be managed. It's not a problem. It's like a chronic disease. Curing it is impossible because it's just the resources would be too much, and but you really wanted to sort of manage it so it's not a national security problem for the United States or its allies. And we had a pretty good plan in place in Afghanistan, I think, to manage it. And we've taken that away. And the Biden administration has said, well, there are terrorist threats from other parts of the world that we have to focus on. Well, the biggest terrorist threat in the world almost certainly is now Afghanistan, where we now have just sort of absented ourselves. The Biden administration has also said, we have to worry about great power competition. Well, Bagram Air Base, there's a reason why the Chinese, the Russians, and the Iranians are quite happy we've left. Bagram Air Base, which at one point had 50,000 American servicemen and women, was a great form of force projection in the great power competition. Now the Chinese and the Russians and the Iranians have a Taliban control of Afghanistan. They're glad the Americans are gone, but they're not completely happy about this outcome either, because the Chinese are concerned about the Uyghurs, the Russians are concerned about Islamist militants and their former republics, and also in the Russian Republic. And the Iranians, of course, almost went to war with the Taliban in 1999 when the Taliban murdered a number of their diplomats. But I think still they're happy we're gone. And unfortunately, I just, I hate to end on a down note, but I am concerned that we're just in another chapter of a long story that began, it didn't begin with 9/11. It's been going on for quite some period of time. And I don't think the Taliban have changed substantially. I think they'll be quite tolerant of jihadist groups using their territory.
Let me ask, I've never asked you this, Peter, and I'll just extend a little bit to do it because, I'm just thinking back about your own trajectory. It's 25 years and more dealing with this guy and this stuff. And, obviously you've become expert on it. People, as I said before, the museum included, turn to you for this expertise. But I'm not asking at that level, but, at the level of how you've lived with this stuff for 25 years. I mean, what's that been?
Well, it goes back even further, Cliff, because as a university student, I went with two friends to Pakistan to make a film. We shot it on 16 mil. It was that long ago. And we had a professional cameraman who must have thought we were the three least competent people in the world because we had no idea about filmmaking or Pakistan or anything. And we made a film about the Afghan refugees, which was shown on Channel 4 UK, which was then the first sort of independent channel in the United Kingdom. So I've been involved in it for a long time and met my wife in Afghanistan in 2007. It's been part of my life. I didn't think we'd be having this discussion in this way, to be honest. But it is what it is. I mean, history kind of marches on, and we try and I don't know. We think there are going to be certain outcomes, and there's a kind of school of thought that history, the arc of history bends towards justice, which in some cases yes, but in some cases no. And I have I'm a student of history. I have a tragic view of history, and I think human nature is pretty stable, suggesting that bad things will happen and stupid things will happen, and evil will be done. And so, it's terrible that we're back in the same place. Luckily, the US is much better defended. But for the 38 million people in Afghanistan, this is a very bad outcome. And I think it won't be a good outcome in other ways we've already sort of discussed in this discussion. Because I don't see a new and improved Taliban.
Yeah. Well, let me thank Peter Bergen again for taking the time. I will digress for a moment and turn to the audience. As you know, it's the 20th anniversary of 9/11. The museum turning more and more to the education of this younger generation. How do you explain to them who were born after 9/11 what this is all about? And this is really going to be increasingly the work of the museum in the years ahead. And so I would ask those of you who can and would to take a look at supporting us through the Never Forget Fund, neverforget.org. We would very much appreciate it. And it would support programs like this very one with the very gracious Peter Bergen. On that note, thank you, Peter. We will see you soon.
Thank you, Cliff.
And thank you, everybody, on behalf of the 9/11 Memorial Museum. I'm Clifford Shannon. Have a good day.